if we as educators broaden what we're focusing on and really highlight things that matter, then parents are going to be better able to make those choices.
Hi, I'm Rick Hess, Director of Education Policy Studies at AEI. Delighted to have with me today Dan Koretz, Henry Lee Shattuck Professor of Education at Harvard University, and author of the new book, The Testing Charade, Pretending to Make Schools Better. Dan, let's start with that. Pretending to make schools better. Well, what do you mean by that?
Well, what's maintained our current test-based accountability system for so long is big increases in scores that are mostly bogus. People have learned how to coach and for the specific tests for which they're held accountable. And we've known now for a long time that this produces gains that are far, far larger than they ought to be. And that in turn allows people to say, well, what we're doing works, but in fact, it hasn't worked very well.
So let's make this concrete. Can you give me a couple examples when you say they're coaching or they're cheating? What do you mean?
Well, there are several things. The first is simply figuring out what's not going to be on the test and dropping it or cutting it back. That can be other subjects. We've had data going back to maybe 1990 about teachers saying, for instance, well, if science isn't tested, I won't teach it. But also people within a subject will say, well, if something isn't on the test, even if it's an important part of the curriculum, I don't get any benefit from teaching it. My favorite summary of that was an 8th grade teacher in Massachusetts who said, why would I teach irregular polygons? She didn't mean that they weren't important. She just meant she'd never seen one on the state test. So she didn't bother teaching them anymore. So that's the first problem. That's analogous to what Volkswagen did with emissions. It's emissions fraud. They figured out which aspects of performance would be measured, and they taught to that by building engines that performed well only under those circumstances. It's what you find in healthcare quality control studies. And it's very common when you hold people accountable for an index that's simply too small. The other is hard. The second strategy, there are actually four, is harder to describe. People find irrelevant details of the tests and train kids to respond to those. A simple example is telling kids if a problem is going to be multiple choice, don't bother trying to solve the problem, just plug in answers and see what works. Well, when they get out of school, no one's going to give them answers to plug in, right? Those strategies sometimes are very sophisticated, but that's a simple example of one. The third way is to play games with who's tested. That's what sent the superintendent of schools in El Paso to prison. Kids disappeared when they came to the right age to be tested. It was done in Houston years ago. In fact, the New York Times reported that some kids were held back in 9th grade because the 10th grade test was most important. And then they learned so much in the second year in the 9th grade, they were promoted to the 11th grade after that. So that's the third method. And the fourth method is just cheating.
How prevalent are these?
Ubiquitous. The first method, which I referred to, which is called reallocation, is found everywhere. We've seen survey data in which teachers say they do this going back to 1988, 1990. Coaching is extremely common. States often actually give teachers materials they can use to do this. They don't have to do it on their own. States will often tell them, or districts, here are the aspects of the curriculum we don't expect to show up on the test. They can just not do it. Cheating, of course, we know less about. There are a large number of documented cases. People know about Atlanta, they may know about El Paso, but there are a lot of others that have made the press in local press in other areas. And if you talk to teachers who trust you, you find out that it's all over the place. They will tell you about cases in their own schools. One of my favorite ones was a teacher who, in her first year, was surprised when her kids on testing day asked where the M&Ms were. And she thought the previous year's teacher had used them as a motivational tool, but that wasn't in fact what she'd done. She'd color-coded the answers. So if a kid was obviously stuck and the answer choice was B, she'd put a blue one down on his desk. It's ubiquitous. Well, I don't want to say ubiquitous, it's widespread. And the more troubling thing to me is a lot of what the press doesn't call cheating really is. There's certain forms of bad test prep, not all of them, but there's certain forms that can only produce fraudulent gains. And those are widespread, and those, in my view, are unethical. They're really cheating.
So, for instance?
So, I'll give you an example. It would be relevant if you ever hire a carpenter to build you a roof. When it's a technical detail, but this is how these things work. When you write a test item about the Pythagorean theorem, there's a problem. Kids are not taught how to calculate square roots. So what do? Well, if there's no calculator portion of the test, you have to make it a simple integer solution. like 3, 4, 5. So Princeton Review simply told kids in Massachusetts, memorize 3, 4, 5. The solution is 3, 4, 5 or any multiple of 3, 4, 5. And if you ask teachers whether they do that, they say, yeah. Well, what happens if you hire a carpenter who actually has to figure out the dimensions of a roof? It's going to fall down. They haven't learned the Pythagorean theorem. They've learned that on that test, 3, 4, 5 will answer the question. And that kind of stuff is just endemic now.
I mean, so this sounds like the problem of bad tests or bad teaching, but in the book, you suggest that it's more than that.
It is more than that. It's not necessarily bad tests. Bad tests make it worse. But tests are necessarily a small sample of what kids know. That's how they've always been built.
What do you mean by that?
All right, so you've got typically, say, 90 minutes or 2 hours to find out what a kid has learned in math or science or whatever. Sometimes in a grade's worth of study, sometimes longer. And the example I often use is that until recently, 10th grade students in Massachusetts had to pass 2 tests, an English language arts test and a math test. The math test typically had 42 items that counted for the students. So 10 years worth of work was represented by 42 items. That kind of sampling works fine if people aren't given an incentive to teach to those 42 items. But they are, and that's the problem. It's a problem that the developers of standardized tests warned us about 70 years ago. And it's a problem that occurs pretty much everywhere outside of tests.
How do people know which items are going to be those 42, though, to do this stuff you're talking about?
Well, it would be nice if the answer were they simply just watched, but it's worse than that. First of all, there are firms that make a lot of money telling you this. And there are districts that will tell you, districts and states that will tell their teachers this. There are 2 reasons why tests are predictable. If they're not predictable at all, then it's really hard to game them. There are 2 reasons why they're predictable. One is it's just cheaper and easier. I mean, it's really, one of my mentors said that people think that the mathematics behind testing is the hard part. He said, that's not the hard part. The hard part is writing a good test item. And so when you have something that works, you tend to stick with something like that. The second is that people want to monitor trends over time. And to do that, you need the test to be quite similar. That's why it doesn't matter what month a kid takes the SAT, because they're all very similar. But once people have caught on to the fact that their well-being depends on that specific sample of material, then things go south.
So it sounds like one response, and maybe, so tell me if this makes sense, is to say, so we need longer tests that take 10 hours instead of 2 hours, and we need less predictable items, and then these problems start to go away?
Well, I actually think, and I actually spent a good bit of time working on this, that we can make the problem a little less severe by making the tests less predictable, but that's not the core problem. The core problem is that the incentives are wrong. The incentives require that test scores go up all the time, unrelentingly, which is unrealistic. You've taught, when you try a new way of teaching something, sometimes it works the first time, sometimes it doesn't. The rate of improvement that's demanded of teachers is arbitrary and in some cases utterly unrealistic. And so people have really no choice but to cut corners. So one of the solutions is to dial back the pressure, to set targets that are realistic. And a second, there are many steps that can be taken, is to actually look at what's happening in schools. If principals had an incentive to go in and look at how teachers are raising test scores and say to them, well, I don't want you doing this kind of coaching, I want real math instruction, then things would be different. But principals have the same incentive, superintendents have the same incentive. Everybody wants scores to go up and they don't care how.
On this realistic expectations point, obviously, education advocates will say, well, wait a minute. We've got lots of kids in this country who we're not doing right by.
That's right.
We're trying to, encourage schools to take these kids seriously, and that's why we need to set ambitious targets. How do you respond to that?
I think the first part of that I agree with. There are a lot of kids in this country who are not doing well enough. There are appalling inequities in schooling in this country. And I think tests have a central role to play in, among other things, making that clear to people. As George Miller said when he explained his support for No Child Left Behind, I want to shed light in the corners. And tests, if they're used right, do that. If they're used wrong, they don't, because they generate bogus improvement. So I think we do have to put pressure on low-achieving schools, but we have to put pressure on them that they to meet targets that they can actually meet, which means setting targets that are at a reasonable level and giving them supports in many cases. Many years ago, Linda Darling Hammond called test-based accountability the kicking the dog harder notion of school reform. The idea that teachers somehow have it in them to do better, but they're just being lazy, so if we give them a kick in the rear, they'll do better. Well, that's probably true of some, but it's not true of a lot. A lot of them really don't know how to solve the problems they're faced with. So if we set more realistic targets and give them supports, give them instruction and modeling of how to teach more effectively, then we can do more for those kids.
So how do we set a more realistic target without setting a target that accepts mediocrity or that's insufficiently ambitious?
Well, there are a lot of ways to do it. I've suggested in the past that one way we can do this is to look at how fast scores have gone up and down when they're not corrupted by inappropriate test prep. And basically to say the fastest increases we've seen when there isn't inappropriate behavior is probably a good upper bound of what we can expect when there is pressure. Bob Lynn years ago said, well, why don't we just pick effective, seriously evaluated interventions and say, well, if under those circumstances we can get gains of such and such a size, that's the most we can expect from you. But short term, that means the gains will be slower. I mean, part of the problem was that the political world had no patience for the slow, hard slogging that education improvement really takes.
So when you look at the targets states are setting out in their ESSA plans for student achievement, is that a lot bigger than what you would talk about as a reasonable expectation? Is it in the ballpark?
It really varies, and it varies by school because, as you know, many states will set higher standards for lower achieving schools. The worst I can recall was a case where schools were expected to make gains 7 times as large as we've ever seen in uncorrupted data. And the response to that I saw, that was, I think, most telling was from a congressional aide who was a former Philadelphia school teacher. And she said, I knew, this is almost verbatim what she said to me years ago. This is during the early stages of reauthorization of NCLB. She said, I know that what I was doing wasn't what I should have been doing, but she said, tell me how else I was going to make those targets. Another example I use is I was a special ed teacher. And among other things, I taught kids who were in the 5th and 6th grade who were, it's a distant memory, but I would say probably the 2nd grade level in reading. Today, this was a long time ago, today they would have been labeled dyslexic. And just telling them that it was time for a reading lesson was aversive to them because they'd failed for so many years. And I wasn't very good at teaching them. But what if I had doubled the rate at which they were learning reading? I mean, in my view, that would have been spectacular. It would not have made them proficient. I would have been a failure under many state systems and under No Child Left Behind because the targets for those kids would have been unrealistic. Another example is that, there was a big fuss for a long time, actually it's still going on, some groups arguing that we should hold kids to the National Assessment's proficient standard. Bob Lynn did a simple study quite a long time ago in which he showed that somewhere around 1/4 to 1/3 of the kids in the highest scoring countries in the world don't meet that level. And we were saying at the time, national policy at the time was that mildly cognitively disabled kids should be there and that they should get there in 12 years.
So what's the takeaway from this? Is the takeaway that that you would encourage folks to do away with testing?
Not at all. I think testing is essential for 2 reasons. First, it's the only way we can really compare progress across states, districts, even schools. In fact, I just finished a study showing that one of the reasons why there's some value in college admissions testing is because it compensates for differences among schools and how they grade kids. So if you think, what are the big policy issues that we have to confront? Are minority kids catching up with non-minority kids? How do we know the answer to that? The only way we know is through standardized testing, right? Recently, Sean Reardon at Stanford has made it clear to us that poor kids are falling further behind rich kids, despite the fact that minority kids are gaining. How do we know that? Standardized tests. How do you know if one teacher is falling down in teaching proportional reasoning compared to what's expected in that grade? Standardized testing. So I don't at all advocate doing away with testing. Quite the contrary. I just think it should be used the way it's supposed to be used, the way that its creators 70 years ago told us to use it. The person who really was most responsible for standardized achievement testing in the United States argued that teachers should give tests in September or October. Why? Because then they would find out what they have to do differently. Not to hold them accountable, but to find out, well, your kids are really stronger in this than in that. There's something going on. I also, a little story about this. The first study of score inflation under high-stakes conditions was one that I did with Bob Lynn and Laurie Shepard, Steve Dunbar, a long time ago, 1990. There was one small district where we didn't see any signs of it. It was a fairly test-driven district. There was no score inflation that we could see. So I called the curriculum director and I said, can you spare some time? I need to find out what you're doing. And I said, all right, tell me what you do if my case is in front of you and my test scores aren't good. What do? Do you point to individual items, which is what people do now? He said, no. We look for patterns. And if the pattern is, for example, your kids are pretty good in computation, these were young kids, but they really fall down when they have to apply it, then we try to find how you're teaching that. We try to give you examples of other ways to teach, maybe other teachers you can watch. In other words, they did good test prep. They used tests to get good information about performance and then focus teachers on teaching the broad domain that the test sampled from better. That's what we should do.
Well, do we know what percentage of teachers or schools are using testing in that way today?
No. We know that a lot aren't, but one of the reasons we don't know is that studies of this are relatively rare. And there are two reasons for that. One is that we don't routinely evaluate programs in education. We ought to. I think it's an ethical responsibility, but the fact is we don't. And the second is that when you ask commissioners or superintendents to have access to schools to find out, for instance, whether some teachers are preparing kids for testing inappropriately, they don't welcome you, right? I mean, and even if you offer a solution, one of the things that I worked on for quite a number of years was finding ways to make tests harder to coach. I found in 5 years of doing that work, 2 places that allowed me to test it out. Nobody wanted to hear about it. So if we had more routine monitoring of what we're doing in schools, then I could give you a better answer. But we do have enough studies to know that both bad test prep and score inflation are rampant.
All right, so if testing and accountability are causing the kinds of problems that you started with, the pretending to make schools better, but you're adamant that we don't want to get rid of testing, what's the way forward?
Well, the way forward is going to be tough work, and we're going to get it wrong some of the time. So I'll preface this by saying whatever we do, we need to monitor it and make mid-course corrections. First thing we need to do is broaden out. It just isn't enough to say we're going to measure 2 or 3 important subjects and somehow the rest is going to get better. It won't. We know that. We know that from fields outside of education as well. It will not get better. So we have to start with the hard question, which is going to be hard because people disagree. What do we want to see inside a school? What do we want to see teachers do differently? Whatever we want that's really important to us has to count. Somehow we have to make it count.
So does this mean that we want to test more regularly in social studies, science, the arts?
Well, that's one option, and that's one that's been followed, for instance, by Kentucky for many years. That works as long as the pressure, and this is the second step, make the pressure to raise scores reasonable. If the pressure to do well on the tests is at the appropriate level, and if steps are taken to avoid inappropriate test prep. The risk is that you'll get a school year that's nothing but test prep and interim tests, which frankly is what it is in a lot of places anyway. So you have to monitor how that's done, but certainly broadening tests would, to the extent that there are good tests, as there is in, say, biology, then broadening testing could be a piece of it. But I think we're going to have to do things that are much more difficult and that involve much more painful trade-offs. So if you look at well-run schools, and I'm thinking about the first school I was in, which was very, very well-run, human judgment mattered, right? My principal would appear randomly. Well, it wasn't random to him, I'm sure. I had no idea. I'd hear a knock on the door, he'd come in, smile, and sit down. And he'd just take notes. A while later, he'd wave and disappear, and that was it. He'd talk to me when he wanted to. I trusted his judgment. He wanted to see what was going on in every classroom in his school. That's extremely hard to make work right. Subjective judgments are always risky. We have a very bad history of performance evaluation in education in this country. In fact, if it weren't hurting kids, it'd be laughable. And it's very hard to do well in a civil service system, but we have to find ways to do it. In some countries, it's done by making some of the evaluation external. So countries like England and Wales and the Netherlands use inspectorates. Singapore uses a mixture of internal and external evaluators. But somehow we have to find ways to give credit to things that really matter, and some of those involve a human being looking at it. There is a teacher who plays a central role in the book who is a teacher of both of my kids here in Montgomery County. She was their teacher only because I demanded that she be their teacher, who was, I think, the best elementary school mathematics teacher I've ever observed. The question I've posed for many people is, read what she did and then ask, what could we do that would encourage more of that? Well, first of all, you have to see that it happens, right? Second, you have to give the many teachers who can't teach that way help in teaching that way. They have to see it. They have to get encouragement to do it. They need mentoring. They need training. There are a lot of very difficult, sloppy things that have to be done that will take a long time and that won't always work very well. But if we don't accept those trade-offs, we're going to get the kind of failures we've been having for 25 years.
You know, one argument by proponents of school choice is that parents are able to take into account a lot of these subtle elements that are harder to measure, and that part of the calculus of charter schooling or school vouchers is that it allows parents to weigh these things alongside testing considerations.
And I think that's right to some extent. There are some parents who can do that. And I think you and I probably both could name a bunch who do talk in detail about what they've observed in schools and what they want to see, even to the level of what kind of reports teachers give back to the parents and so on. And I think part of the problem we're facing is that first, a lot of parents really don't know what to look for. And second, we have fed them a diet of reports about testing being the thing they should look for. And that's what many parents do look for. And I mean, I get calls from people because I study testing, from people, not often, but I get calls from people who want to know where the good schools are. And really all they mean is test scores. So I think if we as educators broaden what we're focusing on and really highlight things that matter, then parents are going to be better able to make those choices. If you look at, if I can go on one step along with that, I'm really intrigued by the Dutch system, which is a choice system, based system. And in fact, it's very charter-like in some respects. And it's also a system that has routine testing. Schools can actually choose to use different test vendors, but they almost all use tests from the same vendor, an organization called CITO. But how does the public see those test scores? They see them primarily in inspection reports. And the inspectors have, I believe, I may have the number wrong, I think it's 15 aspects of practice that they're supposed to observe. So the public gets a report saying, here's a report on the school, here's a report on the school's own goals, what they say they're doing to meet them, here's what the observers saw, here's what the test scores are. With that kind of ammunition in hand, with that kind of information, people can make informed choices.
Has anybody tried these inspectorates here in the U.S.?
Yes, up to a point. There are two things that have gone wrong. One is that because subjective judgment is so tricky and so risky, a lot of districts, as they try to expand beyond testing, and to be fair, a lot of them are now trying to expand beyond testing, wants a standardized instrument of some kind. They don't want somebody to walk into a school, as I did, and watch Norca Padilla teach math. They want a checklist. And that may help. In fact, we have good evidence that those checklists, the better ones, do give you some valuable information. But they're not enough. The other problem is that when real inspections have been used, the devil is in the details. The question is, what are the inspectors told to look for? And the anecdote I use is of a Dutch colleague of mine who studied inspections. That was actually her dissertation. That's what she studied all her career, who got permission to follow the quality reviewers, shadow quality reviewers in New York. Quality reviewers were essentially inspectors. And she did this for 6 months. I asked her to add to her list of things that she was watching for whether they did anything to either monitor for or tamp down inappropriate test prep. And I think it was about 2 months later, she emailed me and said, well, the answer is they're actually fostering it. They're handing out bad test prep materials in some cases. And in fact, one of the things they handed out, a postdoc working for me had with great difficulty, well, not difficulty, a lot of hard, boring work, put together a catalog of released test items in New York so you could see what was repeated for a given standard over time. This inspectors were giving away something a commercial company had produced that was similar to this. They were giving it away as a loss leader for more intensive test prep. And the quality reviewers were handing it out.
And so this was simply to let the teachers know which things to teach and which things to skip.
Well, and it was how to teach them, because they could see all the items that were tested this standard look just like this. I didn't show any earlier, but I brought with me some examples of items that are very similar from year to year. So once you see them, you can see how to cut corners.
Well, this all sounds relatively disheartening. Is there any reason for us to feel like this is likely to get better and over the next half dozen years?
Well, I hope so. I mean, there are some optimistic signs. I mean, ESSA, while I think it's insufficient, at least shows a recognition that the really hardcore version of this done under No Child Left Behind was a train wreck. It was interesting that that bill, No Child Left Behind, started out being a really strongly bipartisan bill. As you know, I mean, you had George Miller and Ted Kennedy on one side, and you had George Bush on the other. And it was reviled by the time it was replaced. So people realized that that version of really draconian test-based accountability was a flop, worse than a flop. ESSA does step back. It does reduce the pressure. It does at least nominally encourage people to look at something else. But it doesn't really question the basic model we've been following. And, you know, we've gone through NCL. This didn't start with NCLB. We've had many different iterations of this going back really to the 1970s or 1980s. But the fact that people recognize that No Child Left Behind was a mistake is a big step forward. And even though I don't agree with what they're doing, I think the opt-out movement is a sign. I think I don't agree with them because I think if you did away with these standardized testing altogether, which many of the opt-out parents want, you'd lose a lot. But they are saying that a sizable number of parents are rebelling against the way tests are being used, or I should say misused. And so if the political winds shift enough, then there might be support for doing some of the harder, slower, more arduous work that we really need to do to make schools better.
Dan, thanks so much for taking the time.
Delighted to be here. Thank you.
Hey everyone, that's the end of our discussion with Dan Koretz. Thanks for watching. As always, let us know what other topics you'd like AEI scholars to cover on Viewpoint. And to learn more about testing and accountability, check the links in the description below.